talking about art is very tricky business. If we were to rewind a couple of centuries ago, this talk would have been, albeit very boring, much simpler to do. I could have just plainly said in black and white that, and pointed to someone specifically and said that this artist is the best out there. This artist creates the best masterpieces. However, since the dawn of modern art, the conversation around art and artists has become very gray. Before the 1800s, it pretty much worked this way, that an artist was approached by a commissioner, and they were commissioned or paid to paint a painting that was usually a portrait of themselves. And because of this, art in the 1800s was, or before the 1800s, was quite dull, very boring, primarily for the rich and very inaccessible. But since the dawn of modern art, artists began experimenting with more abstract forms. They started to use things like composition, style, form, color to depict things that were much more subjective, like moods and emotions. This is a very familiar painting. It's called The Scream by Edward Munch, and it was painted in 1983. Now, of this painting, Munch says the following. He says, "I was walking along a road one evening. On one side lay the city, and below me was the ford. The sun went down, the clouds were stained red as if with blood. I felt as though the whole of nature was screaming. It seemed as though I could hear a scream. I painted that picture, painting the clouds like real blood, and the color screamed." So what does he do here? He says, I felt as though the whole of nature was screaming. So how does he do that? How does he take a feeling or an emotion, something which is intangible, and translate that? He basically took the image of the fort, etc., took reality, altered it into something which is slightly more abstract, but which Munch felt better depicted that moment in time. Now, as the years progress, artists felt less and less obligated to depict things as they appear. And eventually, we arrive at fully abstracted forms, ones which do not even make the slightest of references to the real world around us. Artists stopped painting with their eyes in their hands, but with their souls. And thus we arrive at forms like this. This is a painting by Mark Rothko, and for a lot of people, it will fall under the category of, well, I could probably paint that. And in fact, in attempting to understand Rothko and his work, I even tried. This is me in the process. But yeah, so Mark Rothko belonged to a generation of artists who were called the abstract expressionists. And although the movement was short-lived, while it lasted, it was groundbreaking, tumultuous, passionate, romantic, powerful. Here's some of their other work. You have Jackson Pollock, you have Adolf Gottlieb, you have Barnett Newman, Clifford Still, Robert Motherwell, and Willem de Kooning. And what's special about these paintings is they're not about the image that's depicted. They're a lot more about the experience of viewing a painting. So what do I mean? So for example, for some paintings, there's this kinetic experience when you can actually feel the charged motion of the artist as they created their masterpiece. They would intentionally reveal things such as brushstrokes or other methods used in their creation, so that you can feel that kinetic experience. Again, back to Pollock, for example, you could actually see the way in which the gyps would have followed the movement of his arms. You can kind of imagine the way in which he danced around the canvas to create his piece. Whilst in others, it's more of a sensory experience. Back to Mark Rothko and his glowing squares. The viewer is able to immerse themselves into the canvas. These paintings were quite large. This one is around 3 by 2.5 meters. And because of this, the viewer can literally step into the painting. They can feel as though they are in a space, and they become sensitive to nothing other than color. Now, that's what it basically comes down to, the experience of viewing a painting. And there's a lot that constitutes an overall experience, but one thing that I do want to talk about is the environment in which you view a painting. And two examples that will help me explain this is the Mona Lisa and the Royal Academy, two personal experiences. So for the first one, the Mona Lisa, it's placed in the Louvre in Paris, at the end of a massive room on a wall, all by herself, protected by bulletproof glass. and a semicircle rail that's around 5 meters in radius. The painting itself is quite small, especially compared to the abstract expressionists. And if you're tough enough to push yourself past the crowds, you'd likely only last a minute or so. And because of the circumstances I'm describing, I wasn't really able to connect with the painting. They say that once you go to see the Mona Lisa for the first time, you are immediately struck by her beauty. But in reality, I wasn't struck by anything other than maybe a few elbows to the ribs. Yeah, so despite Da Vinci's masterfulness, I couldn't connect. Compare that with the Royal Academy, which was a lot more calm and controlled. They were having an exhibition of the abstract expressionists, actually. It ended quite recently in January of this year. And my favorite in that exhibition was this piece right here. This is called Blue Poles by Mark Rothko. And for me, this painting is about the rhythm. There's this sort of mayhem in the drips in the background, a little bit like a layered piece of music, very chaotic. And then it's interrupted by a steady beating drum from the blue vertical lines. If we are to compare these two paintings, if we are to compare the Mona Lisa and Blue Poles, one is a portrait of a woman depicted quite realistically, and the other is fully abstracted. What's interesting is that I end up preferring the latter. I end up preferring this one, Blue Poles. And part of the reason, not wholly, is because of the environment in which I viewed this painting. There could be a lot of other reasons, but the environment was a big factor. Now, I won't lie, despite falling in love with this piece, the Rothkos that I saw that day, despite reading so much about them, despite hearing about people actually breaking down and crying in front of his work, whilst I could appreciate them, I just didn't like them. And the point in saying this is that to get the message across that it's completely okay for you to dislike art, for you to not understand it, for you to not get it. But keep this in mind. Clement Greenberg, who was a very famous art critic, he was very important to the abstract expressionists at the time, he said that all profound art is ugly at first. And in fact, I was one of those people who would mock abstract art, especially because of how well it does in the art market. I could not understand the concept of something that seemed so easily reproducible, how that could have such a high monetary value. That's kind of how I stumbled upon Mark Rothko, actually. I was looking for something to make fun of. But along the way, I learned to change my perspective. I learned to look at art in a different way. And that's my message to you, is to be open-minded, especially to the art that you don't understand, and who knows what you might find along the way. Thank you very much.